Hello guys, this is Panzermeister36. Today's video is going to be, once again, your yearly model routing video, because they only seem to do these once every year. In this video, we're going to look at how I repatched and weathered this HO scale Intermountain covered hopper. So I've been trying to keep my model railroad weathering a little bit more streamlined now, because I don't have the time to spend 30 or 40 hours weathering each one of these things, because it just takes way too long considering how many I have. So I'm trying to speed up the process using my airbrush for a lot of the fading and dust effects and road grime and so on, and then just doing the weathering with some basic chipping, most of it with the sponge when I can to speed it up even more, and then just some basic washes that I apply with the brush. And the result, I think, is very, very good. Considering how limited the palette was, it's got some nice layers to the weathering, and I think it's really, really effective. So I hope you enjoy the video. Any questions or comments, please feel free to post them in the comment section below. I always read through those and try to answer as many as possible. I hope you enjoy the video, and now let's get started. So based off of the reference photos I had of these similar covered hoppers with the PV lettering on the side, the ones that didn't have it patched out had it really, really heavily worn. So I'm going to use some microsol to soften up these rolled on / printed on letters. And then I'm going to scrape them with the back of my hobby blade. Now I kind of came up with this idea based off of some videos I was watching by the YouTube channel Dan's Custom Trains, and I'll link his video about doing a very similar technique in the corner here. But this actually worked really, really well. The microsol softened up the red printed on text here, which is kind of like almost like a separate layer. It's not really integrated with the blue. Like, it just scrapes off fairly easily with the back of the hobby blade. And you don't have to push very hard so you don't end up damaging the blue sides of the covered hopper. So it's actually a really, really effective technique, and well, I'm thankful for Dan's video on it because it got me exactly where I wanted. So with the lettering chipped up a little bit, I want to apply a kind of fade, dust, overall dingy coat of 3 parts white and 1 part medium blue from Tamiya. I'm going to thin it with some lacquer thinner. The resulting colors, honestly, I should have probably gone with a little bit of a lighter blue. This kind of ended up a little bit gray, but it ended up alright in the end. So this is kind of just a light gray blue, and my goal here is just to fade down the whole car, make it look sun faded and dusty and so on. You can see the result here versus over there, where it's still very intense blue. And I just apply a little thin coat. I'm not spraying it on. I'm not trying to repaint this. I'm just trying to tone it down a little bit to make it look, like I said, dingy and dusty. And here's the result. Honestly, this is probably the quickest way to weather a covered hopper. Just give it a dusty airbrush coat. And you can see how it further fades our lettering here. And it also does the same with the other printed on lettering on the car. Next thing was a quick repaint of some of the roof panels, once again based off of my reference photos of similar road numbers. So I mixed up a custom green out of a few water-based acrylic paints I had mixed up in the corner there if you want to see it. And I just brushed this on. I think I thinned it with a little bit of water as well, because these AK Gen 3 paints are quite thick, but I just made a custom green and repainted a couple of the hatches up there. Further repainting was done where I wanted to patch over the original markings. So I used some Tamiya tape here, which is really, really good masking tape, but it's also kind of expensive. So I use it for all the fine work between the panels here, or the ribs. And then for masking the rest of the car, I use this Tesa low-tack masking tape that was sent to me by Hamilcar Barkas from Germany. So with all the tape in place, I mixed up a custom gray for the first layer of the patched lettering. This is just black and white, mixed 30% white, 10% black. Once again, thinned quite heavily because I don't want this to be a very thick application. If I do a thick application, I'm going to get paint bleeding around the masking tape, and it's going to be a disaster. I want to build up in a few thin coats. Alright, so I masked up a little bit more, and then I made a slightly lighter gray mixture by just adding some white to my previous one. I don't know how much, I just kind of did it on the fly. And then we pull off all our masking tape, and the result is perfect, again based off reference photos. So now for the actual repainted markings, I'm using the Set by Smokebox Graphics here, which is just generic decals for, you can see here there's a lot of options in there, different font sizes and types, I guess. So if you're looking for something, it's probably in here. I cut out the desired road number, which is my reference photo, but one more because there's no photo of the one that I picked here. And then, just soak them in water for about 30 seconds or a little bit more. While that's happening, I prepare the surface with some Microsol. I don't bother with Microset, I just use Microsol because it seems to work perfectly fine. So we give that area a little bit of a soak to soften it up. And then once these are ready to go after, 30, 60 seconds in water, I will pick them up with my little tweezers and gently put them in place. Now I didn't bother with a gloss varnish because you don't really need a gloss varnish to avoid decal silvering. That's kind of just a myth. Decal setting solution like Microsol is the actual key to avoid silvering. So after they're in place, I apply more Microsol, as you can see here, after I push them down a little bit. This is my second layer of Microsol. Apparently this is where Microset comes into play or something, but I just use Microsol for both and it works perfectly fine. So as you can see, there is a little bit of kind of like, people might call it silvering, but in reality it's just the fact that the decals are shiny and the surface of the model is matte. So at the end, when we give this thing a matte varnish, that will disappear, as you will see. So don't worry about the glosses for decals. It's just a waste of time in my opinion. Alright, now let's get started with the weathering. I'm going to use some straight up white acrylic paint here, and I've put a little bit on a sponge to speed up the chipping process. I wipe off most of the paint. As you can see here, that's still too much paint on there, so wipe off even more. For the sponge chipping technique here, you only want a little bit of paint, almost like dry brushing, right? And then you just kind of lightly tap at the edges, and all the exposed areas that in real life would get caught and scraped up naturally will catch the edges of the sponge here, and the shape of the sponge pattern itself will give you a naturally looking worn or chipping effect basically. So the sponge chipping technique is a great way to speed up chipping while maintaining a convincing looking chipped finish. So this was the intense part of this build. I did a lot of chipping here with the paintbrush. Now this was something that I did because I wanted to replicate a specific photo that had a lot of these weird kind of horizontal primer rust scrapes, sort of. You can entirely skip this process and just do sponge for this if you're just weathering it generically, but again, I'm trying to base it off of a reference photo of a few similar road numbers, so I'm doing a lot of this. This did take a while. I think I spent a whole evening doing just this brush chipping, but I wanted to do it for this specific hopper. So yeah, I'm just using the AK Hull Red paint, thinned a little bit with water, depending on how thick it is, just kind of thinning a little bit so it's the right consistency. And then just doing these horizontal scrapes or wear or pattern, whatever it is. I don't really know how this happened, honestly. It's kind of a unique looking effect, but it was really, really cool, so I want to replicate it. This was taking too long, so I just did the rest of it with the sponge chipping once again, using the same color I was just using there, which is Hull Red. And I use this on the upper edges and things like the end cages and so on, because this is way faster than doing it all by brush. And these exposed details will, like I said before, naturally catch the sponge's texture and make a nice chipping result. So here are the finished chipping effects, and I think they look really good. Again, this took a little bit too long because I did a little bit too much of it by the brush, but if you're doing this, just use the sponge for most of it, and it will look pretty much as good. Alright, now for some washes. I'm going to use some oil paints here. We're starting with this Starship Filth colored oil brusher by MIG Ammo. And instead of doing the wash the traditional way where you thin it down and then apply it, I'm actually applying it straight with the applicator here, and then I'm going to kind of streak it down with this big soft brush. Now there is no thinner on this brush, it is completely dry because the oil paints have a slow drying time, so then I just, after I brush them on with the applicator, you just kind of rub it around with the brush, and you can kind of move it around and keep it more towards the edges if you want, and if it's not to your liking, then you can use a little bit of thinner to wipe it away. My goal here is just to get a nice kind of dusty coat going, but different than the airbrush before because this will give us some subtle streaks in there as well. Alright, so in some areas where you don't like it, or if you want to, let's say, keep these repatched areas looking a little bit more fresh and clean, you just take some enamel thinner and gently brush it on there to suck up any of the extra oil paint. So next up, same thing, but I'm going to use this darker brown oil paint by 502 Abteilung. And this one, I think I thinned it down a little bit to make it more like an actual wash. And I kept it closer to the ribs themselves because I wanted to add a little bit of that kind of like darker fake shadow effect closer to these edges here, just to make it have a little bit more depth, you know, where these ribs stick up from the sides of the panels. Just like before, I'm just dry blending this with my brush here with no thinner on it because the oil paints are still nice and wet. They will dry over the course of the evening. Alright, so here's the result of the oil paints, and this is the most crucial part of the weathering, I think, in how the car ended up looking at the end. You can see how we have the subtle streaking by just the dry blending of the oil paints, and then we have some areas that are a little bit more heavy, and we have all like the streaking on the lower sides around these little hatches here because of the dark oil paint where we applied it selectively. I decided to do a little bit more chipping. Now we're going to do it on the roof walks, and I'm just going to mix up a light kind of like metallic color. I wish I had a light metallic color. I have gunmetal and white, so I mixed them like, I don't know, about 50-50 or so. And then we're going to, once again, to keep it nice and simple, apply it with the sponge technique. So I've just got a little bit on my sponge here in my tweezers. I just lightly tap at it. I'm using the tape to get kind of like an edge at the point between those two roof walks where they meet, just to have it a little bit more defined, but you know, I'm just being a little bit fancy here. So just like before, sponge chipping is definitely the fastest way to get a nice chipping result. So our upper areas and the sides of our car are looking pretty good, but the bottom and also the end cages on the sides here are still very fresh, which is not really realistic because they get really, really dirty too. So we're going to break the airbrush back out again, and I'm going to apply a dusty road grime kind of coat with just some of this generic grayish brown color here, which is Japan Ground Self-Defense Force Brown by Tamiya. I've thinned it even more than I had the previous paint mixtures thinned because I want this to be a super, super thin dusty coat that I can build up in a few passes. I'm also spraying it at a much lower PSI. I'm down to like 12 to 10 PSI at this point. And it's important to keep the car moving so that you get all these different angles, because you don't want, well, you're still going to get them in the end as you can see, but you want to get the car from as many angles as possible so you don't have any kind of corners where there's still some blue showing through, because in reality dust accumulates more in the corners, right? So for a second layer of dust, this one more of like a rust almost, I did the same brown as before, but I added a little bit of yellow and a little bit of red to it to make it obviously a little bit more orangey. And this was done kind of the same way, but even more selectively, because I wanted this to be, I don't know, like a second layer to just add some more interest to those dusty areas. And my reference photos show these things being pretty, I don't know, just pretty nasty on the lower areas. So I'm not sure if this is dust or rust, but you know, it looks good, so that's all that matters. Once again, I'm trying to get in all the nooks and crannies here by keeping the car moving and getting it at many different angles rather than just spraying it kind of from a stationary point. Now you can see that there's still some corners in the very depths of the end cages here where the paint doesn't really reach it. So for that, I'm actually just going to go back with the oil paint we used previously for the generic kind of like washes over the sides of the car. And I'm just brushing it into these corners to make sure that we got some nice grotty nastiness in the furthest depths of this car. So here is the result. As you can see, the oil paint has now collected in all the corners down there, and it looks nice and dirty. And I guess the darker oil paint color almost makes it look like it's damp or wet, which was a happy accident, I guess you could say. So I mixed up the same rust we used previously for the sides of the car, exact same mixture, and I applied it to the wheels and the axles and so on. And I also did a couple more light, almost like precision shots of rust at a couple of random corners on the end cages, just to give us a little bit more of that rusty effect. As for the trucks themselves, not the wheels but the trucks, I believe I had given them the brown XF72 mix that I used on the sides of the car earlier. And again, the same rust mixture. I kind of give a few like selective panels some of this as a little dusty coat. Again, just add some more variation to the sides of the car. Alright, so at this point, it's pretty much done for the weathering. I was happy with it, so I wanted to give it a matte varnish to protect it when I'm handling the thing, and also to lock in all the weathering as well, and unify the finishes because sometimes it gets a little bit glossy. So I'm going to use some VMS Ultra HD matte varnish, whatever it's called. It's just a really, really good matte varnish, and it comes out as like a gel. It looks almost like it's mucus or something nasty, but you don't thin it down. You spray it in its gel-like form through the airbrush at fairly high PSI. This is like 25 PSI or so. You just spray it on like this, and I give it usually a couple of medium coats. I don't want to really hose it on, but I also want it to be a little bit of a wet coat. So I just give the car a couple of overall passes with it, making sure that I get the areas that are going to be most handled, and also make sure I get the areas where I apply decals for sure, because I want them to be nicely unified. And now you can see that we don't have any of that shine anymore from the decals because they're matte, just like the car is, because we gave the whole thing a matte varnish. Final step was, after I'd applied the matte, to go in and apply some of these Smokebox Graphics reflective stripes. I model the current era, so these are a must on all my equipment, which I don't mind. I think they're kind of interesting. Now these things are actually like stickers, so you don't have to do any decal, anything like that. You just kind of stick them on, and then I like to roll them and kind of burnish them in place with a toothpick here, just to make sure that they don't come off or anything. But yeah, that's the last step for my modern covered hopper. And now here is the result of our modern covered hopper. I think it looks really, really good. It has that look of a modern hopper which has had like 3 previous owners, and it's just a rolling mess at this point, but it looks really, really cool. Considering how limited I kept the palette, given my usual my usual weathering process, given how limited I kept it, we still have a lot of nice layering with all these different weathering effects. We've got the chipping, then we got the washes, we got the layers of dust that I airbrushed on, and it just kind of overall, it has a lot of different layers in the finish, which is how you make something look realistic, in my opinion. Now, if I were to do this again, I would do a lot more of the chipping on the sides with the sponge instead of the brush, because it took a lot of time with the brush, and then it kind of didn't really pay off, honestly. Given all the washes afterwards, kind of toned it down a little bit. But anyways, I hope you guys learned something new. Hope you're inspired to try weathering something like this. And if you have any questions or comments, please post them on below, because I always read through the comment section and try to answer as many questions as possible, because I make these videos to help you guys out, so that's why I'm here. Thank you very much for watching. If you want to support me in making these videos, you can do that with the Patreon link on screen now. But if you can't support me, that's perfectly fine. I just appreciate that you guys enjoy watching my videos. So as always, I'll see you guys next time. Goodbye, take care, and happy modeling.